Right. So Florida's native milkweeds. Let's see if I can progress my screen. All right, great. So we can't talk about milkweeds without talking about the monarch butterfly, because the majority of people who are interested in milkweeds are interested because of the monarch butterfly and its plight. It's the monarch butterfly occurs, they're native to many different continents, but our population is unique in that it migrates. Other populations of monarchs do not migrate. In fact, I think it's the only population of migrating butterfly. So the fact that its numbers are declining so rapidly has many people concerned. And milkweed and the loss of native milkweed populations in the US has definitely contributed to that decline. And so even US Fish and Wildlife here, can you guys see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so US Fish and Wildlife here says that is recommending that people plant milkweed and become citizen scientists to monitor monarchs in your area and plant not just milkweed, but other nectaring plants for butterflies. But I'm not going to talk any more about monarchs right now. If you have questions about them at the end, I'd be happy to answer those. But that would be a whole nother presentation, because we have so much to talk about with native milkweeds. So what are milkweeds? Milkweed is a common name for members of the Asclepias genus, which are in the family Apocynaceae, which is also known as the dogbane family. There are about 140 species of Asclepias worldwide, so they're on other continents as well. And there are 73 species in the US, and Florida has 21 of those 73 species. And 2 of those species of our 21 are actually endemic to peninsular Florida. So endemic means that they don't occur anywhere else in the world. They only occur in that specific region. Could everybody put themselves on mute, if that's okay? Okay.
Wade, you might be able to try to put everybody on mute for Lily, especially since I think maybe Jim just called in. He probably can't mute himself. Sorry. Okay. Except we just muted Lily, I think.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, great. Great, Lizzie, if you could stay on the line, that'd be great, just in case. Okay, so we are 70, like I mentioned, there are 73 species of Asclepias in the US, and 21 of those species are found here in Florida. And in particular, the Panhandle, where we both live, is a biodiversity hotspot for Asclepias species. This is a map of the density gradient of Asclepias species. And as you can see, blue is more. So the bluer and darker it gets, you can see here, we've got a lot of species. And so when we talk about milkweeds, there are so many different species, and they all can look very different to a novice, plant person. And so the way you need to learn specific identifying features of this genus in order to differentiate other plants from milkweeds. So they have a specialized flower structure. Just like with most plants, flowers are key to identification. And the flowers of milkweeds are unique and interesting, and they have specific things that they all have. One of which is they have a corolla, which is the petals around the base. And the corolla consists of 5 petals. And underneath the petals are these little sepals, and there are 5 of those as well. And then above the petals is this, you see these hoods, and that is called the corona, that whole section. And the hoods here are called, oh no. The hoods here are called hoods. And then within the hood is a little appendage called a horn. And this hood right here is kind of hollowed out, and that's where the nectar pools. So visiting insects want to come and visit these hoods. And while they're stopping to get the nectar, they're participating in the sex with plants. So the insect will stop here to get nectar from the hoods, and the male and female parts of the plant are fused into this structure called a gynospecium. And that includes the anthers, which are the male parts of the plant, and then the stigma, which are the female parts. And this line right here is called a stigmatic slit. And that is where the insect will pull the male parts, and when it goes to another plant, might accidentally stick the male parts into the female parts. So like orchids, rather than having loose grains of pollen like most plants, both orchids and milkweeds have what are called pollinia, and the singular of that is a pollinium. And there's packets of sticky pollen. And so rather than having like loose grains of pollen that move around, it's these little packets. And there are 2 little packets on each, around each stigmatic slit. And when an insect stops to visit and drink a little bit of nectar, it might accidentally pull up right here and catch this little gland that is attached to the 2 pollinia. And it will pull it out and then become stuck on the insect's leg. They're very sticky. And milkweeds have, I could teach a whole presentation just on milkweed pollination. It's a complicated process, and they have developed a way to prevent hybridization. So each species of milkweed has a slightly different shape of their pollinia and a slightly different shape of the stigmatic slit. So they fit like a key in a lock. So the pollinia of one species fits into the stigmatic split of that species, but it won't fit into another species' stigmatic slit. So in that way, if a bee is visiting multiple species of milkweed, it's less likely to accidentally create a hybrid of those species. So the bee or whatever insect is visiting gets covered in these little pollinia, and then will stop by another flower. And most milkweeds they're not self-fertile. So the pollinia from one plant, it can't fertilize itself. It has to go to another plant of the same species. So having more than one individual planted in your yard of the same species that are 2 to 3 is ideal. That way you can have seeds be produced. Otherwise, it can't fertilize itself. So here's another, I know this is complicated and kind of confusing, but here's another way of seeing it. This is right here is the pollinia, and it is kind of hidden in there. And that's where the insect catches it. And then the insect will carry this to another plant. And then if it's lucky, if the milkweed's lucky, it will accidentally slide one of those in there. And then it sticks once it gets in, and it fits just like a key in a lock, like I mentioned. And here's a photo I took of our native velvet leaf milkweed, and there's a bee with some pollinia stuck to it. And so when it sticks in there, then the insect will pull, and it will either become detached or the insect will become stuck. So certain insects are not strong enough to pull their legs out or to pull their legs off the pollinia. And so sometimes you will see a dead insect hanging from a milkweed blossom. And in this picture here, this is pineland milkweed, and there's a beautiful bee there. You can see right here, that's an insect leg. That I see this fairly often, just a leg sticking out of a milkweed bloom because the insect was pulled as hard as it could and pulled its little leg off. So moving on to all the fun stuff. So I'm going to go through all the species and I'm going to talk about which species are in production as far as like available commercially now, and which species are less likely or are not currently available or are less likely to become available. I mean, I think it's possible that all of them could become available. It's just that some of them are so specialized in their habitat requirements that they're probably not a great choice for most home gardens. And this is one of them. This is definitely our rarest milkweed in Florida as far as number of individuals. This is Curtis's milkweed, Asclepias curtisii. I got to see this finally for the first time last year because I went down to Central Florida to go to see it. And it only occurs down there, nowhere else in the world. And it grows in these very intense situations, in very sandy, like sugar sand scrub. So it requires like open, exposed, deep sand and regular fire return or disturbance in order to, continue to persist in those areas. There I am, very excited to see my first Curtis's milkweed. And you can see the habitat here is scrub. And there's one, this one had some beautiful little highlights on it. And I like to include a few pictures because native wildflowers are typically genetically variable. So they have morphological differences between individuals, and that's what makes the species so flexible and adaptable to changes in their habitat or situation or, predators, etc. The more diverse your gene pool, the more flexible you are as a species in general. And so here you have some that are very pale, almost pure white, and then I spotted this one that was very dark. This is a lovely species. And then this is another species that is not currently available and is likely to not, become available just because the pressure that is pushing milkweeds into, retail nurseries is monarchs. So people want native milkweed to feed their monarchs. And this species, as you can see here, doesn't have a whole lot of vegetative matter to feed the monarchs. So it's probably, and it also occurs in these, sandy, scrubby areas in Central Florida, which, are a particular type of habitat. And so not everybody can grow species like this. So this one is less likely to be available, but it's beautiful and really interesting and is one of the coolest milkweeds in Florida for sure. This is Florida milkweed. My friend Kara, she's right here. She does a lot of work with this species and she's dubbed it fairy milkweed because she thinks it just looks so delicate and sweet. And I could definitely see fairies hanging out with this milkweed. But Asclepias fei is its genus and species. And you can see over here that it's only occurs in Central Florida and doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. And this is, again, like I mentioned, it doesn't have a lot of vegetative matter to feed monarchs, so it's less likely to become, available for production because of that reason. And it's just a really tiny plant. It's also hard to, Kara works really hard doing surveys, trying to find populations of this plant. And it's very hard to see when it's not in bloom. As you can tell, like it's almost impossible to spot this little thing. I was so excited to see this plant too. And then this is my friend, Scott Ward. He works for Archibald in Biological Station in Central Florida, and they have a permit to take collections. And so he was taking this for an herbarium specimen. And so I got to see the root structures, and it has this little tuberous underground root, which lots of our milkweeds have, especially the species that occur in sandier soils, because those species, they have to have deep roots in order to access water because, sand dries out really quickly. So they have to get further deep down in the soil. And then they also have to store that water when it gets very dry, like it does in scrub. And so these tuberous roots are a way of storing water and energy. And they're also, like most of our milkweed species, adapted to regular fire returns. And so if the top burns at a certain time of year, it will still have energy to source later. So you'll see that in a lot of our sandhill species. This species is almost endemic to Florida, but it occurs in just in one county above the Florida line in Alabama as well. So it's not technically a Florida endemic, but almost is. And it is a very rare plant as well. It's listed as critically imperiled and it's state listed threatened. This is southern milkweed, Asclepias virigula. I love this species. I mean, I love all these species, but this one's really cool. It has these flared hoods. The hoods kind of flare out here. And again, the hoods are where the nectar pools, like I mentioned, and then the insects would visit here. And that's that stigmatic slit right there. And you can see this is a diminutive species as well. It's also not currently available that I know of for retail. And it also has a specialized habitat, and it doesn't have a whole lot of vegetative, like leafy growth to feed caterpillars. And its specialized habitat is wet prairies and savannas, boggy areas like acidic, mucky kind of soil. And where you find it, every time I've found Asclepias virigula, it's always growing around carnivorous plant species. And you can see right here, we have Sarracenia flava, the yellow pitcher plant right back there. Carolina milkweed. This is another species that, this one is quite a bit more common, but is unlikely to become available for retail because it's very diminutive, tiny, and it's not quite as particular about habitat. So I think more people would be able to grow it if it were available. As you can see here, it's very delicate and thin. So again, not a lot of vegetative growth to feed caterpillars, but beautiful tiny little blooms. My friend Nicole calls these unicorn colored. It's a really unique color that you don't see in a lot of, you don't see that color very often. It's a stunning kind of lavendery gray color. So this species, just like the other ones I mentioned before, it especially, you notice it after a burn. If you have a spring burn, a growing season burn, it really, like every plant in that area will probably bloom after the burn. In years that they don't burn, only a few will bloom. But this area was burned earlier this spring, and I was out there in, I think, June, and there were so many of them in bloom. I see them all over Apalachicola National Forest. I've seen them in Blackwater River State Forest near you guys. And Savannah milkweed, another species that not so likely to become available for retail, but it because it's so tiny, but it's a really interesting one. It's probably our most unusual species because all of our other species, like, oops, shoot. Okay, let me just get this going again. So all of our other species, like this one, have this section right here is called the corolla, remember? And these are the petals, and almost all of them in other species are reflexed like this. They're bent backwards. Whereas in this species, the corolla and the petals are pushed up and kind of hide the gynospecium where the male and female parts of the plant are. So it creates a unique shape that's unusual for a milkweed. But these are also diminutive species, and they occur typically in flat woods, kind of wet, marginally wet areas. And they're small. They only get like, I probably haven't seen any over 8 inches tall, maybe. You can see I use my hand for reference, for size reference in a lot of photos, and I use myself for size reference in a lot of photos. Okay, green comet milkweed. This is also a very rare milkweed, but it's rare in Florida, but not in the US, which is interesting. It occurs in Gadsden and Jackson counties here, and it almost exclusively occurs in limestone glades in those areas. That's the only place I've seen them. And so it grows much further north, like way up there, but it just barely dips its toe into Florida. So it's nice to get to see it. It's a cool milkweed. It has a really interesting flower structure as well. It's state listed endangered because it's so rare here, but not rare in the US. Here's a better look at the flower structure. These are the hoods, and they're very reduced in this species, which really exposes the gynostecium, which is where the male and female parts are. And then the corolla and petals are extremely reflexed. And I think that's where it probably gets its common name, green comet milkweed, because they look like little green comets. And this is a glade in Gadsden County that I have seen these milkweeds blooming in. Michaud's milkweed. This species definitely could be produced commercially and probably be grown successfully in home gardens. It occurs in kind of marginal flat woods area, kind of the ecotone between the sandier upland and the kind of more low-lying wet areas like boggy areas. And it is a small milkweed though, so not quite as much food for caterpillars. It usually has just one stem, and the stem will be leaning over to one side, kind of prostrate on the ground. And it can vary in color from whitish and green to this pink, which is really lovely. And there's a little crab spider in there. If you start taking photos of native plants, you become interested in native insects because you get to see a lot of insects. And here's a species that I would really love to see more in production, to become more available for home gardeners. But with all of our sandhill species and upland species, there are some hurdles to growing them successfully because they're used to, particular loose sand, and they don't like being in pots so much. So there's just been a kind of a learning curve for growers to figure out how to successfully propagate these species. And so this species is in production in different nurseries, but the supply can't meet the demand. And that's pretty much the case with a lot of our native milkweeds right now. Is there's such a high demand for native milkweeds, and there's just, the growers can't keep up with the supply for them. But this is sandhill milkweed, Asclepias humistrata. It's a conservation priority species because it's one of the most important species for monarch caterpillars. And that's because it's the first native milkweed to be up early in spring, when the monarchs migrate, from the East Coast down to Mexico for the winter. They overwinter in Mexico, and then they come back up the East Coast. And this is what they stop at when they're really hungry after that long winter. They stop on sandhill milkweed and lay their eggs. And it's the only milkweed that's up right then. So it's really important that there's a lot of it around. Here, those are my feet there standing next to a very old, very mature Asclepias humistrata, sandhill milkweed. It has really unusual leaves, and these leaves, there aren't any other milkweeds in Florida that look like this. There aren't any other plants in Florida that look like this. So it's really easy to identify with it. But that individual could be very old. And it's suspected that a lot of these sandhill milkweed species can live for a very long time. But I don't think anybody's been able to do that research yet. Again, there are those beautiful leaves. Another unique feature of this plant is that it has the highest level of the toxins that milkweeds have. I didn't mention that at the first slide, which I should have mentioned, but milkweeds have a toxin called cardiac glycosides. They're a type of cardinaloid. And basically it's it's an evolutionary adaptation to prevent herbivory. So it's made itself toxic so that insects and animals won't eat it, right? So that it can reproduce and prosper. Evolution is an arms race, and the plants are always trying to prevent being eaten, and the insects and herbivores are trying to always eat. So they're always evolving with each other and co-evolving. And monarchs evolved to be able to digest those toxins, the cardiac glycosides. And that makes them, they bioaccumulate those toxins in their bodies, and that makes them toxic to things that might eat the monarchs. So that prevents predation of monarchs. It's a great strategy for monarchs to have adapted to eat this toxic plant that makes them toxic to predators. So birds can't eat monarch caterpillars. They might try, but they'll spit them out because they are toxic. But different milkweed species have varying levels of these toxins. And this species in particular has the highest of all of our native milkweeds. It has a very high toxicity. And so even though the monarchs are adapted to withstand that toxin, often it's too much. The caterpillars will actually die on this plant because it might be too toxic for them. And I put the date here in April 2nd. So that's very early for a milkweed to be up and and blooming. So here's a little tiny caterpillar right here on a leaf of sandhill milkweed. Another way that caterpillars can die on milkweeds, in this species in particular, is that the sap comes out so quickly, this latex sap that contains the cardenaloids, and it can actually just make a sticky mess, and the caterpillar can kind of suffocate in that sap. So that can happen on other milkweed species as well. And one of the ways that caterpillars have adapted to that is that butterflies will often lay eggs on the flowers, which have less sap, and then the little babies will eat the flowers first. Or the larger caterpillars would take a bite out of a stem of a leaf, and that cuts off the circulation so that there's less sap in the leaf, and then they start to eat the leaf. And you can just see the differences in coloration between these individuals here in the leaves. I always find that super interesting and exciting. Oh my gosh, that's my hair right there in that photo. That was a beautiful photo though. This is just such a stunning species. And as you can see, I put lots of photos in of this species because I love it so much. But this species, I see a lot of beetles on. I see these types of longhorn beetles, and then also the delta beetles and scarab beetles on these a lot. And I would suspect that they're probably successful pollinators of the species. So here's another beautiful individual of sandhill milkweed. And if you look closely here, there's a little delta beetle. I gave you a little close-up of him. How cute is that? He's just flying with his little legs out. So again, it's not just an important plant for monarchs, it's an important plant for all sorts of insects that rely on nectar. And there's this, I saw this guy this year. This was just such a stunning specimen. And then also as these blooms age, they turn kind of a yellowish color. So sometimes you'll see them with some yellow. Okay, so in speaking about upland sandhill milkweed species like this one, the Asclepias humistrata, I mentioned that there's some difficulties growing them, and one of them is that with these species that are adapted to sandy soils and frequent fire returns, before they put much growth on above ground, they send tap roots down deep. That's their first. It's an evolutionary adaptation to be able to survive if there's a drought or if there's a fire when you're a tiny little baby plant. So you put your energy down into the soil first before you send up a few more leaves. And so that can be an issue when growing plants in pots, because they don't like to have their taproot be all wrapped around in a short little pot. It's not healthy for the plant and it can stunt their growth. So growing them in different growers have tried growing them in deeper pots, these long pots like this. Ideally, it's best to just plant the seeds directly where you want them to grow. But collecting seeds for growers is also a problem. So we all want native plant growers to grow more native milkweed species, but where can they get the seed? Because there are only so many plants out there. And with milkweeds in particular, as you can't harvest the pods before they split open. The seeds are not mature enough and they won't germinate successfully. So, and yet, once the pods split open, then they have these little fluffy things attached to each seed called a coma. And as soon as it splits open, they fly off if a breeze picks up. And so it becomes, this difficult situation of trying to get seeds in order to start and grow plants when there are only so many plants out there. And then as soon as the seeds ripen, they escape. So growers, one way that I've harvested seeds successfully is putting rubber bands around the pods, or putting like a little tiny mesh jewelry bag and tying it on the pods so that they can split open, but that the seeds won't get away. And then, so here's an example of why growing like this is not such a big plant above ground, but it would not have grown in a pot successfully, because once you start digging to see, to remove or to relocate, I should first mention these were dug with permits, and they were dug because there was going to be a road widening, and we wanted to relocate these plants so they weren't destroyed. But you shouldn't be digging plants from the wild, period. It's depending on where it is, it's often illegal, and it's not good for them. It's not good for the species as a whole. So let them be where they are unless they're in danger of construction or something like this. And then you can call the Native Plant Society and we can plan a relocation. So I started digging this plant, digging around the plant, and it went, I probably could have gone 5 feet down into the soil. The roots go very deep. You can see our volunteer Preston here standing with one of the sandhill milkweeds, and you can see how long those root systems go, and they just go straight down. So growing these species on a large scale is not easy. And so having some patience with growers and understanding that this is, growers are trying to provide these plants for us, but it's not easy for them. So they're also just very slow growing. And so, getting a of size plant that is worth buying, it takes years. So, all right, velvet leaf milkweed. I have seen this milkweed available for sale. This is a really interesting species that occurs, has a really distribution. I think, did I include a map of it? No. Well, this is where it is in Florida, and it has some populations, I believe, in the Carolinas, and then one population over in Texas. There are 3 disjunct populations, and it's hypothesized that they're occurring on ancient sand dunes. And so they grow in very sandy soil, and the leaves are kind of velvety, hence the common name. The leaves to me look so much like a little oak sapling, but there are the hoods and the little horns. And then again, this is the corolla with the reflex petals. And this species is variable in coloration, just like the other ones. This is the same species of bee that we saw on the other milkweed earlier in the presentation. This is Bombus fraternus, which is a rare I think it's southeastern bumblebee is the common name. It's a rare bee that I started, putting on iNaturalist because I was curious about it, and I didn't know that there are so few reports of it in Florida, but I see them on milkweeds quite a bit. So again, their leaves, when they're not blooming, they look a lot just like a little oak sapling. But when this species matures, it can become, about 2.5 to maybe 3 feet tall, which could take, I don't know how long it takes for these to mature, but they could take a really long time to mature. But they have this stunning tiered, inflorescence with all these different blooms. And it's just they put on a real show. This species, like I mentioned, it's hypothesized that it occurs in ancient sand dunes. And so it has very deep roots as well. And in relocating some plants, we've found that the roots can go like 6 feet to 8 feet straight down into the soil. So they're very deep rooted plants. So this is another kind of milkweed. There are different types of milkweeds in different habitats. There are all sorts of milkweeds, but in Florida in general, we have milkweeds that are in sandier upland soils, and then we have milkweeds that grow in more wet, moist soils. And the ones that grow in more wet and moist soils tend to be species that are easier to grow in your yard, and they grow a lot faster and they mature a lot faster than the upland species. So they tend to be species that are more available in the retail nursery business. This species is not super available because it's very rare in Florida. It pretty much only occurs where you guys are. And that's red milkweed, Asclepias rubra. And it's not red. I don't know why it got that name, but as you can see, it's a lovely shade of pink, and it has very pointy hoods. The hoods go straight up like a little crown. I love that. Isn't that gorgeous? And then the little horns come and they almost touch in the center here above the gynostoecium. And it has it has a relatively adequate amount of, vegetative matter to feed monarch caterpillars, but it has typically pretty long linear lanceolate leaves. There's a little green link spider there. And then here is longleaf milkweed. This is another one that is found in wet and moist soils. Oh, I forgot to mention, oops. This one is found around carnivorous plants as well in wet bogs and seepage slopes. So if you know spots like that where you are, that's a good place to see it. And longleaf milkweed, this is definitely another species that could be grown in home gardens, and then hopefully, I haven't seen it available for sale, but I would love to see it. Hopefully someone will start successfully growing it, because I think it would be very popular. It's fairly adaptable as far as soil types. I've seen it growing in slightly drier soils to more wet, mucky soils. So that means that it would probably be more adaptable to a home garden. And it's stunning, and it's fairly fast growing. There I am with a nice patch of it. I didn't even say its name. It's Asclepias longifolia, longleaf milkweed. And the little blooms remind me of like little firecrackers almost. And this species has reduced hoods like the Asclepias vertiflora does, and nice big long reflexed petals, which are lovely. So cute. Isn't that gorgeous? And you can see right here, I didn't even notice when I was taking this picture, but then I got home and I noticed there's a little mantis, a little praying mantis right there. All right, this is a really interesting, this is such an interesting distribution. And it's likely what you're seeing is limestone outcroppings. It occurs in like limestoney glade areas in the panhandle. And then in this area, it's probably limestone outcroppings as well. And this is green antelope horn, Asclepias viride. This is native further across the United States as well. it's a real showstopper of a species. This is a pretty robust large plant. Let me go forward here. Did I include? No, I didn't. I should have included a photo with my hand, but this is probably about 3 feet to 3.5 feet right here. And so they have big, fat, wide leaves and very large blooms. The blooms are at least like quarter, a little bit larger than a quarter. And the petals, rather than being reflexed, are kind of spread up. And then the hoods are this beautiful purple color, which really contrasts lovely with the kind of lime green of the petals. It's a stunning species. It blooms in early May, and it only blooms once and then doesn't rebloom. Most of these species only bloom once and then don't rebloom. But here it is occurring in a limestone glade in Gadsden County. Large flower milkweed. Oh, and I should have said this, the Asclepias viridi, I have not seen it available for sale in the US, or sorry, in Florida, but I have seen it in further northern states in the US. But if you're buying milkweed for Florida, you definitely want to buy plants that are grown from local ecotypes, that are from plants that occurred in Florida. So the reason for that is because our habitat is much different than North Carolina or further north. And so they're best adapted to our area, and they will be more likely to prosper and to thrive if they are native ecotype. All right, large flower milkweed. This species is a real showstopper as well. It has comically large hoods. They're just very large. This species occurs in wet prairies and savannas, just like the Asclepias ferigula and Asclepias rubra. And it's pretty easy to spot even from a distance because they're so large. You can see here, me sitting next to it, like the blooms are very large and those hoods are like at least about an inch long. And there's a little crab spider on there. And they have kind of rounded and succulent type kind of leaves that are real pretty, interesting leaves. So there you can see my hand. Those hoods are massive. They're just massive blooms. So that's really interesting for a milkweed. It's probably one of the largest flowers of native milkweeds in the US. It might have the largest flower. I'm not sure. I should look that up, but there's a little ambush bug lying in wait right there for a visitor. There I am standing with a very large one. This one I'm about 5'2", and so this was a tall, probably about 4 feet tall. And again, those beautiful hoods. And I should mention, I don't know of anyone growing the large flower milkweed, but I think it could be a species like I mentioned, the more wet adapted species are faster growing and seem to do better growing in pots. And so they're better for commercial production and retail. And so it's likely it could be a good choice for that. Clasping milkweed, Asclepias amplexicaulis. So it's called clasping milkweed because you can't really see right here, but the leaves kind of, they clasp around the stem and kind of touch each other from either side. They're opposite leaves. And this species is definitely, I have seen this available for sale, and it's an upland species, so it is slow growing and it prefers sandier, well-drained soils, but it's not uncommon in Florida, and I see it fairly often, and it has very wide and thick leaves with typically wavy leaf margins, like you see here. And it's super variable in coloration of the flowers. So this is the same species, but has a very different color. And here are those wide leaves, and you can see how the leaf like clasps the stem there. I was bike riding with my friend Erica, and I spotted this milkweed, and it's obviously, from a distance, it's not taller than she is, but they get at least 5 feet tall. Some of them have actually been taller than me, but that's uncommon. Usually they're about 4 feet. And again, very variable coloration. Some of them are strange. And this one was just dripping in nectar. And you can taste that nectar. It's just sugar water. But milkweeds tend to produce and push out the nectar in early morning. So I probably took this photo earlier in the morning, and this individual was just full of nectar, trying to invite some pollinators. And here's another beautiful coloration. I saw this one in Blackwater River State Forest. There's two little monarch babies right there, nibbling. And just some more examples of the coloration of the species. So again, this is a upland sandhill species. It is in cultivation, but it is slow growing. And I've noticed, I've grown some before, it does not like being moved around. It's very reluctant to move. Oh, here's even more coloration. Look at that, so much variation and morphology. Okay, pineland milkweed, Asclepias obovata. This is another upland species. It's pretty common out where you guys are. It also grows in kind of clayey, red clay areas, like the roadsides along in Blackwater and around Blackwater area that have those, steep red clay like cutouts through the road. You will see Asclepias obovata growing along those roads. And it blooms in like July, I think. Has a really interesting pattern on its leaves, the leaf veination. It's kind of like almost like little honeycombs, and thick succulent flowers. It only occurs in the panhandle. It does occur further north. Again, this is a lot of color variation in individuals. And typically this plant is about 2 feet tall, but this one was very long. And occasionally you just see very long individuals. And this is also a very dark coloration for the species. Usually they're more this color, but I also saw this one in Blackwater River State Forest, and you can see that red clay road. And there's my friend Scott staring at it, Asclepias obovata. Again, that beautiful veination and the succulent hoods. They look just so, they're just so stunning. And world milk, oh, and I should have mentioned as well that the Asclepias obovata is also in cultivation. It's, fairly slow growing, but it definitely is not a really difficult species to grow. World milkweed, Asclepias verticillata. This is a common species throughout the US actually, and it's very, very common in Florida, but it's often overlooked because it's so diminutive and thin leaves and small blooms. Here's my hand here. You can see it doesn't have a whole lot of vegetative matter if you're trying to feed caterpillars, but it is a plant that is in production because it's fairly adaptable, easy to grow in pots, and it is prolific. It's all over the US. But so its common name is called world milkweed, and that's because rather than being arranged in pairs in all opposite leaves, the leaves are in whorls around the stem. So there are multiple leaves all in a whorl around the stem. And then you can see here, they have tiny, very tiny little blooms, but they have lots of blooms. And there I am standing with a very tall one. Usually they're about 1 foot to 2 foot tall, but this was out in Blackwater too. I spend a lot of time out there. This was a really tall individual that was just growing on the roadside. And there's a lot of variation in the bloom size and shape and color. If you begin to look closely at them, like these are, the blooms are very spaced widely apart in this individual, and they're very light green compared to some of them that are close, more densely packed. And this one is very light green as well, but yeah. There's another little delta beetle. You often see delta beetles on milkweeds. Oh, so we saw the Asclepias virigula earlier in the presentation, and this one occurs in wet, boggy prairie savannas. They're often confused, but they're very different habitats. So if you are in, if you're near pitcher plants, it's probably not this one, unless you're in the uplands above pitcher plants. If you're right in the kind of prairie and savanna, then, or seepage slope, then it's going to be Asclepias aurigula. And if you're in the more upland or ecotone, then it's probably verticillata. But another way to tell is the Asclepias aurigula has needle-like leaves, just like verticillata, but they're quite a bit longer. And then the real key for me is the flowers on the virgula are slightly larger and the hoods are flared out. Whereas the hoods you can see on this verticillata are kind of small and kind of shortened below, abbreviated kind of below the horns. So these have large flared hoods and the verticillata does not. Red ring milkweed, Asclepias variegata. This milkweed always reminds me of teeth. They're just quite a pure white. You don't often see such a pure white in a milkweed, but this is a lovely one. Even in bud, it's a lovely species. And this species is also in cultivation, and it's a great choice. It is slow growing, but it grows in a lot, in areas where a lot of our other native milkweeds won't grow. It will grow in woodlands and in shadier areas and in kind of clayey or rich woodland soils, which most of our milkweeds don't grow in. So you can see the habitat in these photos are like hardwood, hammocky kind of, lots of, leaf matter on the ground and not a whole lot of sun being exposed. So a lot of people in my area, living in Tallahassee have yards that look like this. So this is a good species for a yard like that. They are slow growing though, so you have to be patient. It could take, 5 years to go from a medium-sized plant to getting it to bloom. And the common name is red ring milkweed, Asclepias variegata. And that common name comes from this little ring, which is more of like a kind of a maroon reddish color. And that's, where the name comes from, red ring milkweed. There's a close up there. You can see, look at those. They're so rounded and tooth-like. And they have these beautiful big leaves. Few flower milkweed, this is actually one of our more common species. And it is somewhat in production. It's not, I haven't seen it very often being offered for sale, but it is a more wetland type of plant. So it is faster growing and more likely to succeed in a home garden because of that. And it's called lanceolata because it's got very lance leaves, very lance-like leaves, long, thin leaves. These aren't stellar photos, but it's hard to photograph the plant as a whole. And they have stunning blooms. You'll see this species growing around the coast in kind of marshy areas and also in wet ditches further inland. And they have, a variable coloration in the flowers. So it's neat to see that. Some of them are like have a kind of purpley gynostecium, which is really interesting. But I also should mention, this plant gets very tall. And so that is one of the, I think, hindrances in the retail industry is that it gets very tall and it's just one long tall stalk. And so it's not a super, attractive plant to have in a little pot. So, that's what growers have to take into consideration. This is one, so now we're getting into species that are more commonly available in the retail industry for purchase for home gardeners. So this is swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and this is definitely a great species to grow if you are wanting to provide native milkweed for monarchs because it creates a lot of leaf matter. It has really pretty blooms, but it only blooms once a year. I can hear my dog howling in the background. And it is a wetland kind of plant. It grows in mucky, swampy soils. And so it's more adaptable to home gardens and it's fast growing. And So it's a top choice for monarch larval food in home gardens. And when a monarch strips the leaves off this plant, it grows back fairly quickly. So a lot of our sandhill species, if a monarch eats them down, they don't necessarily resprout back out quickly to create more food for caterpillars. So that's something to take into consideration. And so this species is a good one to feed monarchs with. It also is a little bit easier for growers to propagate because you can grow it fairly successfully from cuttings. And unfortunately, it does not produce very much seed because it only blooms once a year. And then if the flowers don't get fertilized, which they sometimes don't with milkweeds because they have that complicated fertilization process, then they don't produce seed. So they're also flowering late in the year, right around hurricane season. So it's happened a few times where, these plants are putting on their seeds and developing their seed pods, and then a hurricane hits and the plants get knocked out. So like I mentioned, this plant provides a lot of vegetative food for caterpillars. And as you can see, it gets very big. That's me standing next to a population that is at least 6 feet tall, and it's got a bunch of seed pods putting on, and you can see those nice big leaves. Lovely colors in this nice little grasshopper or katydid. And so, as I mentioned, this is a great choice for growing in your homes. It's much more available in the retail nursery spaces now. This is a population that I grew at home at my old house, and it did really well. It was really easy. And then this is a population that was planted in a local water reclamation park in Tallahassee here, and they're thriving there. They're just planted right on the edge of this little pond. And yeah, they're doing great. And I see monarchs on them. They get robust, like I mentioned, they get very tall. So those are big, thick stems, and they can get that big in a couple years. So again, these more wetland species are much faster growing. And so they tend to be a better choice for home gardens. So one interesting fact about this species is that it is native up into Canada, but there's this big disjunct between populations in Florida and the populations that occur further north. And what I have found is before this plant was available in seed from native ecotypes, I tried growing some seed that was available for further north populations, and they would grow for a year and then they would not come back. They were essentially annuals. So I also noticed that the leaves and flowers were fairly different on those more northern populations than they are on ours. The leaves on the top of the leaves in the northern populations are kind of pubescent, where ours tend to be glabrous. And so it's possible that it's just a distinct ecotype, or it could eventually be split out into a subspecies or a variety. But there will have to be genetic work done on them in order to figure that out. But it's really important, if you're going to be buying this plant for your yard, you want to make sure that it comes from Florida ecotype. Otherwise, you're getting an annual. Aquatic milkweed, another great choice for home gardens. Very easy to grow, very fast growing, blooms prolifically. Like I mentioned, the pink Asclepias incarnata blooms once a year. This plant blooms nonstop. It just keeps pumping out the flowers. This is an unusual species in a lot of aspects. And it's a conservation priority species because it definitely is a good choice for planting in yards and gardens and restoration sites. It's pretty quick and easy to grow. It can be grown from cuttings or from seeds. And because it produces so many flowers, it produces way more seeds. And it's hypothesized, I don't know that anybody has proven it, but I think it's highly likely that this species is actually self-fertile, whereas our other species, their own pollinia cannot pollinate their own flowers in one genetic individual. And you need another genetically different individual of the same species in order to pollinate another plant. So with this species, if you just have one, you can still get seed. Whereas with the other ones, you need more than one individual in order to get seed. And if you buy plants from a grower that was growing them by cuttings, then they're all genetically identical and they will not produce seed even if you have 5 plants. So that's another thing to take into consideration when you're purchasing a plant. But this species, Asclepias perennis, grows in very mucky, wet soils, swampy soils, and it will grow in shady areas as well. So that's another thing that makes it much more adaptable to yards, different types of yards. And it will grow actually in areas that become completely submerged and where water will be, a foot high, and this plant will still be surviving and thriving in that. And that's why it's called aquatic milkweed. There are different ecotypes of this plant within the state of Florida. And further south in Florida, they tend to be shorter and they tend to have more narrow leaves. Whereas this is up on Highway 98 in Wakulla County, and it had, was hot, pretty tall. Most of them tend to be about a foot or so, but a few of these more panhandle individuals tend to be 2 to 3 feet tall. And then they have wider leaves as well. And as I mentioned, it will grow in water. And because of that, it doesn't rely on wind for dispersal of its seeds. And so it doesn't need those fluffy comas. It's the only species we have that just has bare seeds without those fluffy comas. And that's because it just opens and drops its seed in the water, and the water moves its seed for them. Here I am standing in water, and there's a Asclepias perennis, a aquatic milkweed right there. And actually in this same swamp, I saw a monarch caterpillar that was on one of these, and it had eaten it down to a nub and then was just sitting there because, the adult had laid an egg on it, but the caterpillar can't crawl off anywhere to get to another plant. So, it was kind of screwed. But it's a lovely individual. It will grow in full sun or full shade. It's adaptable to different soil types. And again, it blooms prolifically. So it's a great choice for gardens. And because it blooms so much, it produces a ton of seed, which makes it, really easy to propagate for growers. And so this plant is one of the most readily available of our native species. And another aspect about it is most of our native milkweeds have what we call a natural senescence, which means that they go dormant in the fall and they die back to their root system, and then they resprout in the spring because, they're overwintering. But tropical species like the non-native Asclepias corasavica, because in the tropics they don't have seasons, it's always summer. Those species don't have a natural dormancy period, so they stay up. And this species, this is the only species of our native ones that tends to stay up in the winter. And that can become a problem because if you know much about monarchs, you've probably heard of this parasite called OE. It's a protozoa that parasitizes monarchs, and it can accumulate when an infected monarch lays eggs on a milkweed. The OE can accumulate on that plant, and if the plant naturally dies back in the winter, it essentially cleans itself of that parasite. The parasite can't get back on the plant. But if the plant stays up all winter, like this species does, or like the non-native Asclepias corasavica does, then it can accumulate on the leaves and to dangerous levels. The monarchs can carry a certain load of this parasite before it really starts to negatively affect them and kill them. And that is one of the big issues with the non-native Asclepias corasavica, the milkweed that you see everywhere and that was pretty much the only one you can readily buy at a store. That plant doesn't naturally die back. And so it tends to accumulate a lot of this OE, and then people raising monarchs on those plants are essentially killing them and aiding in their demise. So cutting back your milkweeds in the fall is really important. If they haven't died back by Thanksgiving, you should cut them back, even if they're native ones like this, to clean any OE that might have accumulated on the leaves. Okay, butterfly milkweed. This is also pretty readily available, and that's because it's native all across the US. And it's most likely that if you're buying it at a big box store, then it's not a native Florida ecotype, and it will probably die after a year or so. But if you get a native Florida ecotype, then they're really tough perennials and they're fairly adaptable. And we have 3 varieties in Florida. They're not counted in the 21 species, but you know, at some point they might become species, probably not, but right now they're just recognized as varieties. And another point about butterfly weed is that it tends to be the least favored of the milkweeds because it has very little of the natural cardiac glycosides, the latex toxins that are in most milkweeds. And so if you break the leaf of most milkweeds, you see that sap coming out, but on this species, it has no sap. And so it has very little of those toxins, and monarchs actually are attracted to plants that are higher in toxins because they want to be, you know, unpalatable to predators. And it's part of their defense system. So this plant is less favored, but sometimes it depends on what the adult butterfly had fed on. If it had fed on a plant that had very high toxicity, like the Asclepias humistrata, and then it might lay its eggs on a plant that has lower toxicity to balance it out. So they sometimes, I've grown lots of milkweeds in my yard, and sometimes you would get a whole batch of baby caterpillars that would go straight to the butterfly weed and eat it all up before they touch the other milkweed. So it just depends on the life cycle of that individual monarch. But so this species has no sap, none of that milky latex. But monarchs will definitely eat it if they run out of other food. And this plant, hence its common name, butterfly weed, is highly favored by adult butterflies for nectar. So all sorts of butterfly species like this zebra swallowtail here love to visit it for its nectar. And so again, it's important to get the native ecotype of this species rather than one that's from, you know, Minnesota or something, because it probably will not thrive here. And then another thing to consider with this species is if the plants are being grown from cuttings, they often will not become perennial. And I'm not sure why that is, but that's another thing to consider. And again, lots of genetic variation in this plant. These are all individuals in Florida. And yeah, lots of coloration differences. And so I'm just going to go over the varieties that are found in Florida. This is eastern butterfly weed. This is one of the less common species found in Florida. It is found in more clay and loamy soils. The leaf bases are typically rounded or cuneate, and the leaf margins are not wavy. And then this is a species that we see more often in, oh shoot, did I mess this? Oh shoot, I did mess this up, sorry. Oops. This, did I not put in? Oh, there it is. Yeah, this is var rolfsii. This is the most common one in Florida. This is the species you typically see in sandhills it has wavy leaf margins, and the leaves tend to be, the leaf base is truncate or subcordate, with often with these hastate basal lobes, like little ears, kind of. And they're usually widest above the midpoint, and the leaves are usually about twice or 3 times as long as they are wide. And this is Varrolfsii, sandhills milkweed, and you can see its range right here. The flower coloration doesn't mean anything in identification of the species. And then this is a really interesting, unique species that this is not Varrolfsii. I should have taken that out. It's not a named variety yet. Right now, Alan Weekly, who has written the flora of the southeastern United States, calls it Asclepias tuberosa var2. It will probably get a name at some point, but it's only in central Florida and scrub, and it's often unusually tall and lanky. You can see this tall one over here. And it has short and very wide leaves that have rounded leaf tips. So back here you saw these have a pointed leaf tip. This is the Rolfsii that we see most common, especially that's the one we see in the Panhandle most commonly. This one down in Central Florida is very much shorter leaves, fat leaves, and rounded. So I find it really interesting that there's this weird variation in the Panhandle. So now, how do you find native milkweeds to purchase in your yard? And so I talked about some of the issues that growers are facing and why it's taking so long for supply to meet demand. And again, as I mentioned, if you want to grow some of these sandhill species, be prepared to be patient, both in accessing the plant and in the plants growing in your yard. They're slow. They put roots down deep and invest their energy in their root system before they invest in flowers and leaves. And they require, well-drained, sandier soils. If you have heavy clays, they're not going to be quite as, they're not going to be quite as successful. So if you're wanting to find places to purchase these native milkweeds, I recommend you go to this website. It's called plantrealflorida.org, and it is put up by the Florida Association of Native Nurseries. And over here on the left-hand side in the menu, it will say retail native plants. And if you click on that, then it will show you a map of all of the native plant nurseries in Florida. And then you can click on one of those nurseries that is closest to you, and you can actually see a list of the type of the species of plants that they typically carry. So it might not be a comprehensive list, and working and managing a native plant nursery for years, I know that your inventory changes hour by hour. So they're kind of listing the species that they often keep in stock, but if you want to know for sure, before you go, you should definitely give them a call, ask them. And even if they don't have the plant at that time, if you request it, they will often look for it for you and then call you when they come in, or you can pre-order it and pay ahead and they'll get it in as soon as they can. So there's also an online nursery in Florida called Mail Order Natives, and they sell a variety of native milkweed species. You can see Asclepias obovata, pineland milkweed, verticillata, variegata, incarnata, and they will, you don't even have to go to the nursery. You just order them online and they're shipped to you. So I wanted to do a little review and go through all the species that we went over. These are alphabetized because I made these for a Native Plant Society post. And starting with class bean milkweed, Asclepias amplexicaulis. And then we have large flower milkweed, Asclepias conivens. And then Carolina milkweed, Asclepias cinerea. Florida milkweed, Asclepias fayei. Curtis's milkweed, Asclepias curtisii. Sandhill milkweed, Asclepias humistrata. Few flowered milkweed, Asclepias lanceolata. Longleaf milkweed, Asclepias longifolia. Pink swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. Can't remember the common name of this one, but it's Asclepias pedicellata is the species. Pineland milkweed, Asclepias obovata. Michaud's milkweed, Asclepias michaudii. Aquatic milkweed, Asclepias perennis. Velvet leaf milkweed, Asclepias tomentosa. Red milkweed, Asclepias rubra. Oh, what's a common name? Oh, red ring milkweed, Asclepias variegata. And butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. World milkweed, Asclepias verticillata. And then green comet milkweed, Asclepias viridiflora. And green antelope horn, Asclepias viridii. And then Florida milkweed, Asclepias viridula. And so again, milkweeds are in the family Apocynaceae, 21 species native to Florida, 73 in the US, around 140 worldwide. And then we have our 2 endemic species. And so what I wanted to leave you with is just a reminder that that what you plant in your yard matters. And so increasing the amount of native plants in your yard is critical to the continued functioning of our ecosystem that support life on Earth, including our own lives. And so it's important what happens in your yard. So even the little decisions of what plants you take out and what plants you plant makes a big difference to a lot of many different organisms upon which we depend on, even though we don't realize it. If you haven't read Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, I definitely recommend that book. It is an incredible just really wakes you up and makes you realize how interconnected we all are and how important native plants are. And this is his quote, which says, "Which animals will make it and which will not? We help make this decision every time we plant or remove something from our yards." And that's it. Can you guys, if you're still awake.
Yay. That was fabulous.
Yeah, great.
Wow. Wow. That was something.
Yeah. I mean,
Did
we
you-
learned so much. I didn't expect to learn that much. I listened to your
Oh,
talk
good.
already on Lunch and Learn, and I learned a lot more.
Good. Yeah, this is definitely, I did a whole different presentation than that one, which was much more focused on the monarch milkweed interactions. And so if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have some, but I'll wait and let other people talk first if anyone has any.
I just say, like with the perennis,
Uh-huh.
I have no moisture on my property at all, and it
Yeah.
still grows. It's dry and it still grows. It's small,
Yeah.
it blooms and it's there and it grows.
And if you amend the soil with a little bit of organic matter, like just work some leaves into the soil or some mushroom compost, that will probably liven it up a little bit. But it's surprisingly tough. I've been very impressed with that species.
I was also curious with the art incarnata. Again, my property is very, very dry, but I have built berms and swales that pull water off the street. And I've got this incarnata planted right in the swale. And so far this year, they're blooming now. And believe me,
Yay!
we get the least amount of rain in anyone in Pensacola.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah. It's really incredible how adaptable those wetland species are. They're not technically wetland species, all of them, but the ones that grow in more moist soils, they're much more adaptable than the ones that are adapted to sandy soils.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to see if everybody else could, you could hear everybody else, or if Dwayne unmuted everyone. So.
I can hear you.
Okay,
Do you
good.
have a question to me?
I don't. My perennis that I got at the plant swap that we had, I think I got it from you, Dwayne, that it has very slender leaves. But it's
It-
small.
It
So
could
not
be from a South Florida ecotype.
okay.
I got it, gosh, where did I get it from? I got it from one of the Santa Rosa master gardeners over there at a plant sale at UF.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Lily, I've got a
Interesting.
question. We, you probably know, like out here, we don't have a lot of native plant nurseries. We had Dara Stabson, but she's closing soon. So that's like a common problem. But I'm curious about growers out near you guys. Do you know about growers? Because we are getting some like grassroots native plant nursery things going. Do you have any information? Because does like the SAN give information on growers too?
Yes, so that plantrealflorida.org also has, I can actually switch back to that. It says back here, landscape, wait, no, it's a different website. If you Google, like growers, native plants, I guess,
Mhm.
you could find a listing, but, oops, sorry. But the closest that I would say that are like, there's there's one small native plant grower in Tallahassee, but she only contract grows. She doesn't sell outside of that.
Yeah.
And then the closest I would say is in Lee, Florida, and that's Superior Trees. That's where
Okay.
almost everybody buys
Yeah.
plants. And Superior Trees is actually the same nursery as the online mail order natives, that page that I showed. So they have two businesses that are technically separate, but they source the same plants and they're the same family. They all work in the same office.
Yeah.
And they sell online, retail, and then their wholesale business is on site. So if you're purchasing retail, then you can't shop wholesale, obviously. But if you're wholesale buying for like, for a plant sale or something like that, then yeah, Superior Trees is great. They're really nice. They're wonderful. Amy Webb runs the place there.
Okay.
And yeah, she's
I'll say that we have, for everybody on the call, we have an order that we're going to place with Superior Trees in October through Emily Peterson with Garden Gate. So I was going to be sending out an email about that because she's getting her Garden Gate sort of set up as a version 2, a little bit different. That was a local native nursery we had here in Lilly. But we're gonna try to. She's setting it up where it's a nonprofit now, but she is gonna try to do some orders. So
Good.
for everyone on the call, we'll be
it's really hard to stay in business as just when you're just plain selling native plants. The business that I ran was, we had a gift shop and a wild bird store, and so there were other things keeping us afloat, and like vegetables and perennials and non-native plants. So just selling native plants, it's hard to make money. There's so much impatience. I feel like talking with people who want to purchase native plants, they don't understand why they're not more available. There's a lot of, disappointment and frustration, but it's a tough business to make money in. Nobody goes into it to make money. Everyone I know is working their hands to the bones and, have very little profit. So, I just want to impress upon people to be patient and kind to growers.
That's good. That's good advice.
Yeah. And they're trying to produce these plants for us. It's just, again, the supply cannot meet the demand. There's just such high demand.